Those grounds, when I walk them, they speak to me.
We discover among these embattled warriors friend, cousin, brother.
I hope they will be proud of all of the people who worked so hard to make sure that that legacy stayed alive.
There is no culture we know of that does not honor the ground in which they bury their dead. Cemeteries are our culture's most common sacred places. When such places are desecrated, the stones themselves cry out. But the dead are not silent. Their bones still speak. The past will rise up to confront the present and tear open old unhealed wounds, whether at the African burial grounds in New York City or at Freedman Cemetery in Dallas, Texas.
When they first put the expressway in, they just bulldozed through.
What was left of the cemetery was turned into a city park. Playground equipment was put on top of unmarked graves. Protests from the black community were ignored for decades.
I would like to see the entire community, regardless of race, embrace it.
How this racially divided community finally came together to save the cemetery from further desecration can be a model for other divided cities. It is a story of courageous survival, triumphant accomplishment, casual betrayal, and finally, redemption.
I lie beneath the earth. I float under the sea. Do you think of me?
I was always jealous of the Anglo Cemetery at the convention center, where all the pioneers are recognized and it's well kept. And got the cattle going through there now. And even as a boy, we would pass there. And that told some stories of their pioneers. But what about the people who really did the work? The people who toiled the fields to buy the white folks those carriages. And if indeed cotton was king here, the African slave crowned him. What about my great-great-grandmother who scrubbed the floors and probably nursed the little white butts and scrubbed them? There were no memorials to her, to Nicey and Nanny, my grandmother, names like that, Nanny, Rowan. There were no memorials to them. This will patrol, let people know that they were here, and they have been here for some time.
Like most U.S. cities, Dallas had almost no collective civic memory of its black pioneers. Its monuments honored white accomplishments. This oversight was compounded by a brutal indifference to the black community's concern for its most historic cemetery. This important site was first desecrated in 1872, when eminent domain was evoked to take part of it for the Houston and Central Railway roadbed. It would be desecrated again in 1949, when Central Expressway was built on cemetery land. The black community feared their ancestors would never be allowed to rest in peace and dignity.
I don't know where I'll go, but I'm free. There's got to be a place somewhere for me.
Upon emancipation, Dallas County had no free blacks. Now, what happened in much of the rest of the South was that emancipated blacks could gravitate towards those already established communities that were established by free blacks. Dallas did not have that. Every community here was started basically by former slaves who didn't have anyone else to go to.
That cemetery always played a great, well, from the beginning it was there, from the first Juneteenth, because those ex-slaves who were brave enough, those freedmen, they squatted on land where the cemetery was.
The people in this area, the slaves in this area, because plantations were all around the city, came to the Freedman Cemetery because they huddled together out of fear. They felt they were safer in numbers. And they, surprisingly, they didn't meet most of the dangers that they feared, because the whites, especially here on Thomas Avenue, which was an exclusive white part of the city, they need workers, they needed cheap labor.
I think about the railroad and the many people who came, and the African Americans who came into this area to work early on, right after the Civil War. And many of those people are interred here. They helped to build that railroad and do many of the jobs that were relegated to them as early pioneers here in the city.
One generation after the end of slavery, the residents of Freedman Town, North Dallas, had created a tightly knit community that met all the needs of its residents.
In the 1890s, we had my uncle Sam Miller, Henry Miller, who's buried in the cemetery. His brother owned several saloons. They owned one called Miller and Sanford's, and had another saloon called the Black Elephant. And they say the Black Elephant was the devil's rest spot on earth. And so, you know, those guys, they were all so colorful because they were doing things that really hadn't been done before. They were free. These people who had just come out of slavery, they were very serious about not ever going back again, mentally or physically.
This was happening throughout the South and primarily throughout the United States. These pockets were developed in these cities due to the limitation of movement and restrictions on full participation of African Americans in the American way of life during that time. So it was nothing unique to Dallas, but it's unique to Dallas the way Dallas did it.
Black physicians operated clinics and hospitals. Restaurants and cafes flourished. Nightclubs and bars brought in black celebrities such as Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway. Historians have documented one reason the community was so cohesive. It was for mutual protection against the hostile white community that surrounded it. In Dallas in the early 1920s, 1 out of every 3 adult males over the age of 18 was a member of the Ku Klux Klan.
Well, I experienced it very definitely within my own family. My father was very openly and vocally opposed to the Klan, but several of his relatives, cousins and nephews, etc., were in the Klan. And so it split families, and certainly it split church families within the community. It always went under the guise of patriotism. And this was the great red, white, and blue patriotic thing to do, is to join the Klan.
For instance, in 1923, there was a KKK march in downtown Dallas. This was not the first, but it was the first one where they took their hoods off, and the sheriff of Dallas was leading that march. Now, if you live in Freedmanstown, and a mile and a half away, several thousand KKK members are marching. The terror is unimaginable.
You know, whether they were affiliated with the Klan or not, you knew they were not your friend back in those days, and you knew you couldn't expect very much from, you couldn't expect justice
The combined stresses of segregation and terrorism shaped a community that was determined to take care of its own from the cradle to the grave. When no insurance companies would insure them, they provided their own insurance. When no hospitals would treat them, they built their own hospitals.
The movies were there. The YMCA, I used to go to the YMCA in that community there as well. Of course, the high school was in the community there as well. So education was there, the religion was there. All the social organizations were there. It was so cohesive and tightly knit, you know. You knew the doctors and the attorneys and the newspaper reporters. It's the cemetery that has given cause to the development of this community in the location that it was.
Freedman Cemetery was closed by the city in 1907, but oral histories and much of the excavated coffin hardware indicate that people continued to bury their loved ones there until the 1920s. By the time the expressway pushed through North Dallas, the Freedman Cemetery had been closed for more than 20 years, but that did not lessen the black community's outrage.
I remember my uncle coming to pick me up, so I had to be maybe third grade, or somewhere between the first and the third grade. But he heard of the talk of the master plan. And he cursed. He said, these damn white folk gonna take our cemetery again. And I didn't know what he meant then.
The African American community realized the freeway was going to have a devastating impact on their community, but the bitter truth was that they were almost powerless to do anything to stop it.
We had no one to speak to. There was not a black person even in City Hall, not even working there. We were not allowed jobs. We were not allowed municipal jobs, not even trash men. We were not hired, especially during the Depression.
There were none in the government. Our first city councilman was named in 1967, and it was an appointment. And then later, they were elected.
When you think of a group of people had to have legislation passed for everything that everybody else takes for granted, and they have to spend added resources and time and energy fighting for those things that everyone else gets just by being human, you know, they have to establish priorities in terms of what is going to get our attention, what is the most important, you know, right now.
After Central Expressway split the community, people began to move away. Soon the cemetery was remembered mainly by the old people who still lived nearby. The city of Dallas eventually placed playground equipment on the cemetery land.
The younger boys would go to the cemetery and play, and the older women or people would pass by and chase us out of there and tell us that's hallowed ground. And so we knew it was something special, although there were not tombstones on there.
And there things remained until the 1980s, when the Texas Department of Transportation began widening Central Expressway. News of their plans to take even more of the cemetery galvanized the African American preservation community.
People in the preservation community began to talk about it when they found the first burials back in 1985. Black Dallas remembered, got involved in it, the Landmark Commission, the Park Department. But all of these people came together with a recognition that this was one of the most important resources here in Dallas that reflected the heritage of those who were here when Dallas was a baby.
When they first put the expressway in, they just bulldozed through, and they threw bodies away and used headstones for landfill. That's like 40 years ago. This time when it happened, we had an archaeologist on the site. We studied it. The community got together and wanted to build a monument to commemorate this site. That shows a lot of progress.
By the mid-1980s, the Freedman Cemetery project was underway. The Texas Department of Transportation worked in partnership with Black Dallas Remembered and the African American Museum to bring the story to the public.
The trees are part of the cemetery themselves. They're 100 years old.
The woman that worked in it, Jerry Henderson, was very thorough. Jerry went over that whole cemetery with a toothbrush and a toothpick. And she went through every scoop of dirt, She labeled, she photographed.
These were real living people just a few generations ago, and that changed everything for me. I also, by the way, buried my own mother during this project, and I became so closely involved with it because it was a delicate business of getting the remains out of the ground with dignity without harming them further.
Eventually, more than 1,100 had to be moved to another part of the cemetery. The remains were carefully reinterred in the order in which they had been found. But previous desecrations had been so severe that out of all the thousands of graves on the site, only one tombstone survived intact.
This is the headstone I was telling y'all about of Emma McCune. She was born a slave, born in 1855, died 1903.
Historians know that Emma McCune was 48 years old when she died of breast cancer. But since her headstone was moved at some point, they do not know the location of her grave. Emma's headstone quickly became the symbol of the project and would figure prominently in the design of a memorial for Freedman's Cemetery.
We had a vision of what we wanted, but actually, as it turns out, this vision has even been exceeded by what you see today. 1994, we held a selection panel, and in 1994, David Newton came on.
Well, it's one of those things you say, it took my whole life, because I know my ancestors were in each one of these phases. They were free in Africa, they were enslaved, and they were emancipated. So I get to tell my own personal family history along with the collective family history of all African Americans.
Newton's design reflects the African American genesis. Visitors are greeted by a warrior whose symbolic job is to protect the site from further desecration. Next is the griot, an oral historian whose job is to keep the story of the cemetery alive so it will not be forgotten again. Walking through the archway, visitors not only move from Africa to America, but also from the old religion to the new religion on a walkway in the form of a Christian cross.
And on the back side of the arch, we have two enslaved African figures. So we go from freedom on the front of the arch to enslavement on the back of the arch. I have a male who is struggling against his chains, and that represents the fact that no slave accepted slavery or wanted to be a slave. It's something that had to be enforced by violence. I have a female figure that represents violation. Her name is Violated Soul, basically, and that shows that there was a lot of violation of women, and that was a major part of the slave trade.
Moving on into the site, there is a symbolic grade lowering to represent movement into the land of the dead. The center group represents emancipated African Americans, a man and woman embracing as they contemplate news of their emancipation. Their backs still bear the scars of the whip. Behind them is a stone tablet engraved with a poem written by Dallas poet Nia Akimbo. On the other side is the tombstone of Emma McCune.
I think a monument like this is definitely a healing. It's part of the healing process.
That Newton envisioned a healing space from the very beginning was what impressed the selection committee. Through monumental presentations, he wanted his narrative creation to allow us to connect with the images on very personal terms. Newton wanted a memorial not just for the African American community, but for all Americans.
The scars of the whip that are on the figure of the emancipated person is also on the person who created or maintained or was complicit with the institution of slavery.
You must be quiet to hear them sing such sweet songs of life's morrow.
At the groundbreaking for the memorial, Ramona Austin led a libation ceremony, a ritual acknowledging that the living and the dead exist in a relationship together. In order for the living to have harmony in life, we must not only honor our dead, but also evoke the power of memory, through which our ancestors can help and sustain us.
Just look at the wall. I got my hands to my face, 'cause I don't wanna see it. Oh, no, no, no.
The Black community must be free to honor those who have gone before them. I would like to see the entire community, regardless of race, embrace it, because the ancestors in this soil are particular to Black people, but they're universal to everybody in this community. It's a part of the historical struggle. It has made us all. And whether we like it or not, we are bound to each other.
See you away, Mama say.
This is something real. This is nothing, it's not a legend, it's something tangible that they can see. You know, you can touch this. This is something that is a part of who they are in this place.
I think it resonates with so many of those of us of color because we can't go to the library and look in the genealogy section and find out, oh, you know, who did own, you know, the slaves? You know, what family did I come from? And so what few places there are in this country where there is a connection, you know, a physical connection that we can say, here is where freed slaves lived, worked, played, died, were buried, becomes a place for all of us.
Memories are also within our very bodies. And people will come to this site, I believe they do come to this site, because they are making a connection with that. You know, it's the very fact that the ground is marked that is the important thing. The bodies of those that we cared for are here. And whether I'm not a native Dallasite, but it becomes an evocation of my great-grandmother. You know, it's that kind of memory. So someone like me, whose direct descendants are not buried here, they are here for me symbolically.
I've always had an interest in history, but this has connected me to the past more than any other thing that I've done in my life. I feel a sense of responsibility to tell the right story, the accurate story, not from my perspective, but from the individual's perspective who lived in the town, who are buried in the cemetery, who are now living, to make sure that what they tell me comes through exactly the way that they told me.
Regardless of where you are or where you're from, when you go there and you see that sentinel standing there, and he looks so big and black, and David did such a good job on putting that detail on him, and you see the little kids who are touching his feet, rubbing his leg, you know, and nobody's saying, don't touch that, don't do that. That place needs to be every day yellow school buses around it and tour buses coming through, just to touch the ground, just to know that it's somebody greater than us was here, you know. These were the people who built this town, who made this country, who fought in the wars, you know, who gave us democracy when they couldn't fight for democracy, when they couldn't spell it, you know. That's the thing that the whole Freedman's concept, the whole North Dallas concept is about. We lost the buildings, but we didn't lose the spirit.
Those grounds, when I walk them, they speak to me. And they speak to me in song, maybe in poetry. I'm sure it's probably in my imagination. Those oaks, November days when the wind blows through there. But they say, free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. They sing other songs that I've heard from black people who had no hope. They sing of freedom. They sing of hope. They sing of sweet chariots carrying them home because they walked. They never had a carriage. They sing, I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. That's what I hear. And they've laid it down. I ain't gonna study war no more. That's what I hear.
War no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Gonna meet my dear old father down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna meet my dear old mother down by the riverside to study war no more.
Production of this program was made possible in part by Guarantee Bank, specializing in middle market and small business financing. We promise to treat your business like it was our own. By a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the National Educational Telecommunications Association, and by viewers like you.